The flight attendant froze with her hand inches above the boarding pass, her practiced smile disappearing as three passengers stared openly at the 17-year-old black teenager standing in the business class aisle with a faded duffel bag over one shoulder and an old silver pocket watch resting quietly in his palm. Nobody spoke at first. Then someone near the window whispered just loudly enough to spread across the cabin. "There has to be some mistake." Marcus Reed did not answer. His dark eyes drifted toward the aircraft door instead, as though he expected another passenger to appear before it closed forever. The boarding music continued playing softly while people shifted in expensive leather seats, exchanging uncertain glances. The silver pocket watch never left his hand. One businessman folded his newspaper with obvious irritation. A woman across the aisle reached for the overhead call button. Another passenger leaned toward the flight attendant. "Can you check that ticket again?" The attendant accepted the boarding pass with professional calm, scanning it once, then again. Her expression barely changed, yet something behind her eyes did. She looked from the screen back to Marcus, then quietly scanned the pass a third time. A soft confirmation tone sounded each time. Everything appeared valid. Still, she did not step aside. Marcus remained perfectly still. He did not argue. He did not look embarrassed. His fingers brushed the smooth metal cover of the old pocket watch before he gently closed it with a delicate click. The sound seemed strangely loud inside the silent cabin. Through the nearest window, rain streaked across the runway lights, turning every reflection into long silver lines. Marcus glanced at the watch again. The hands pointed stubbornly to exactly 8:17. They had not moved once since he boarded. A little girl seated several rows away noticed it first. "Mom," she whispered, "his watch is broken." Marcus heard her, but offered only a faint smile before slipping the watch back into his palm instead of his pocket. A few rows ahead, Evelyn Harrington lowered the financial report she had been reading. At 58, the white billionaire investor had flown thousands of times. Yet something about the teenager's quiet patience caught her attention more than the restless complaints filling the cabin. She watched the way he stood, not defensive, not frightened, simply waiting. Waiting for what? She could not tell. The captain announced another brief departure delay due to an operational review. Groans rolled through the cabin. Several passengers immediately blamed the unexpected interruption on the teenagers standing in the aisle, even though no one had been told why the aircraft remained at the gate. Marcus never looked toward them. His attention returned once more to the still open boarding door. Every few seconds, his thumb gently rubbed the worn engraving on the silver watch, as though repeating a silent habit learned years ago. Evelyn noticed the tiny initials carved into the metal before Marcus instinctively covered them with his hand. Moments later, a gate agent hurried onto the aircraft carrying a tablet instead of luggage. She walked directly past every occupied seat without hesitation. The flight attendant met her halfway, and both women quietly studied the screen together. Their expressions changed almost instantly. The gate agent looked up, searched the cabin, and spoke words that caused every nearby conversation to stop. "Which one of you is Marcus Reed? There is a permanent instruction attached to your seat assignment, and none of us have ever seen anything like it." Marcus slowly raised one hand without releasing the silver pocket watch. The gate agent studied him for a long second before walking closer, lowering her voice enough that only the nearest rows could hear. "Sir, would you please come with me for a moment?" Before Marcus could answer, the businessman who had questioned him earlier leaned into the aisle with a satisfied smile. "I knew it." The ticket finally failed. Several passengers nodded, relieved that someone else had voiced what they had been thinking. Marcus looked once toward the still open aircraft door, then quietly asked, "Will I lose this seat if I step off?" The simple question caught the gate agent off guard. She hesitated. "I cannot answer that yet." Marcus remained exactly where he was. "Then I would rather stay here." The response rippled through the cabin like a fresh spark. Murmurs became louder. A woman near the front sighed dramatically. "He is making this difficult." Across the aisle, Evelyn Harrington folded her reading glasses and watched every expression instead of every word. The teenager never raised his voice. His shoulders stayed relaxed, but she noticed one detail that almost everyone else missed. His thumb continued tracing the worn edge of the pocket watch, as though counting invisible seconds that refused to move. The gate agent stepped aside and called someone through her headset. Within moments, another airline employee climbed aboard carrying a portable scanner connected directly to the reservation system. The attendant scanned Marcus's boarding pass once more. Green. She scanned his government identification. Green again. The second employee frowned at the tablet. His reservation is fully paid. No fraud alerts. No duplicate booking. Everything matches. The businessman laughed softly. Then explain why you stopped the entire airplane. No one answered. Instead, the employee tapped deeper into the airline records. His eyebrows slowly lifted. There it is again. The flight attendant leaned closer. Read it. He swallowed before quietly replying. Access restricted. Executive authorization required. Every nearby passenger fell silent. A restricted note attached to one economy passenger would have been unusual enough. Attached to a business class seat, it felt impossible. Evelyn stood and crossed the aisle with calm confidence. Excuse me, she said politely. I am not asking you to violate policy. I only want to know whether this young man has done anything wrong. The employee answered immediately. No, ma'am. Absolutely nothing. Evelyn looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Then why are they treating you like they expect something to happen? Marcus met her eyes only briefly before glancing toward the aircraft door again. I think they are waiting for the same person I am. Evelyn followed his gaze instinctively. The jet bridge stood empty. Rain continued tapping against the windows. No footsteps approached. No late passenger appeared. The silence stretched until the headset on the gate agent crackled sharply. She listened without speaking. The color slowly drained from her face. Understood, she whispered. She ended the call, looked directly at Marcus, and spoke words that froze the entire cabin once again. Headquarters has ordered us not to move this aircraft until someone from historical operations arrives. They specifically requested to see the pocket watch in your hand. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence broken only by the steady patter of rain against the windows and the distant hum of ground equipment outside. Nobody reached for a magazine anymore. Nobody checked a phone. Every pair of eyes drifted back to the silver pocket watch resting quietly in Marcus Reed's hand. He did not hide it, but he did not offer it either. The gate agent remained near the aircraft door, speaking in clipped sentences through her headset before glancing toward the jet bridge every few seconds. The delay had become something far stranger than a routine operational issue. Evelyn Harrington watched Marcus carefully. She had spent decades building companies by recognizing when people were pretending. The teenager was not pretending. Whatever burden he carried had settled on him long before he stepped onto this airplane. She finally stood and walked the few steps separating them. May I ask you something? She said gently. Marcus nodded. Is that watch valuable? His fingers tightened around the smooth metal case. Not because of money. Does someone expect you to bring it? Marcus looked toward the empty aircraft door again. Someone promised they would meet me if I reached this seat. Evelyn followed his gaze, feeling an unexpected chill despite the warm cabin. Who? Marcus lowered his eyes. I do not know if he is still alive. Before she could respond, the aircraft door opened once more. A gray-haired airport employee wearing an identification badge marked historical operations stepped aboard carrying a weathered archive box secured with 2 brass clasps. The unusual department name immediately stirred whispers throughout the cabin. The man greeted no one. Instead, he stopped several feet from Marcus and studied the teenager in complete silence. His eyes slowly shifted to the silver pocket watch. May I see it? He asked. Marcus hesitated for the first time since boarding. Every passenger leaned forward. After a long breath, Marcus carefully placed the watch into the man's waiting hands. The employee opened the cover with surprising familiarity. The stopped hand still pointed to 8:17. He turned the watch over and gently wiped away years of wear with his thumb, revealing a faint engraving beneath the tarnish. His face changed instantly. I knew I had seen these initials before, he murmured. The businessman who had challenged Marcus earlier stood halfway from his seat. So what is it? A family heirloom. The employee ignored him. Instead, he unlocked the archive box and removed several yellowed folders protected inside clear sleeves. He searched quickly before stopping at one brittle photograph. He held it beside the watch. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same silver watch rested in the hands of a smiling airline captain standing beside a younger man near an aircraft from decades earlier. Gasps spread through the cabin. Marcus stared at the photograph as though seeing it for the first time. My father never showed me that picture, he whispered. The employee looked at Marcus with growing disbelief. Then there is something else you have never been told. Before anyone could ask another question, his radio crackled sharply. He listened for only a few seconds before closing the archive box with both hands. His expression hardened. Nobody touches these records until the airline's executive historian arrives, he said. Because if I am reading this correctly, someone erased an entire chapter of this airport's history, and that seat was never supposed to belong to a stranger. The words hung over the cabin with a weight no engine could overcome. Someone had erased part of the airport's history. The gray-haired employee locked the archive box again and held it against his chest as though it belonged in a vault instead of an airplane. The businessman who had spent the last half hour questioning Marcus finally lost his patience. This is ridiculous, he snapped. We are delaying 200 people because of an old photograph and a broken watch. Several passengers quietly agreed. The tension shifted once more toward Marcus, and he felt every stare without lifting his head. Evelyn stepped into the aisle before anyone else could speak. If the airline believes these records matter, then perhaps we should stop assuming they do not. Her calm voice carried farther than shouting ever could. The businessman folded his arms. Or perhaps they are entertaining a story. Marcus looked at him for only a second. I never asked anyone to stop this flight. The simplicity of his answer left the cabin silent again. At that moment, the public address speaker chimed softly. Instead of the captain's familiar voice, a dispatcher spoke with careful precision. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Departure remains temporarily delayed while the airline completes a historical documentation review. The unusual wording spread fresh confusion through the rows. Historical documentation review was not something anyone had ever heard before. Outside, the rain began to ease, and the lights along the runway reflected across the wet pavement like long ribbons of silver. Minutes later, another airport vehicle stopped beside the aircraft. A woman in a navy blazer climbed the stairs carrying a slim black case sealed with a red security band. Even before she reached the cabin, the historical operations employee straightened his posture. Executive Archives, he whispered under his breath. The woman introduced herself only as Director Collins. She did not apologize for the delay. She simply opened the black case and removed a leather-bound registry whose pages had darkened with age. She turned carefully until she reached a bookmarked section, then compared it with the photograph and the silver pocket watch. Her expression remained unreadable. The registry confirms the seat number, she said quietly. But the corresponding file has been intentionally removed from the digital system. A murmur rolled across the cabin. Someone had not merely lost a record. Someone had erased it. Collins looked directly at Marcus. Who told you to book this exact seat? Marcus swallowed before answering. My father left me a letter. He said that if I ever had the chance, I had to sit here on this date and bring the watch. Did he explain why? Marcus slowly shook his head. He died before he could. Evelyn watched his face soften for the first time, grief passing silently through his eyes before he steadied himself again. Collins closed the registry. Then your father knew something our company forgot. Before anyone could process those words, the captain emerged from the cockpit, holding a folded message that had just been delivered electronically. He read it once, looked toward Marcus in disbelief, then handed it directly to Collins without saying a word. She unfolded the page, her eyes widening as she reached the final line. After a long silence, she looked up and announced, the board of directors has just authorized the opening of a sealed company vault that has remained locked for 31 years. They believe whatever is inside was intended for the passengers sitting in this seat today. No one moved after Director Collins finished speaking. Even the impatient passengers who had spent the last hour checking their watches seemed to forget the delay. Somewhere beyond the rain-speckled windows, a service truck rolled slowly across the ramp, its amber lights sweeping through the cabin like silent waves. Marcus stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the silver pocket watch now resting in his open hand. It still read exactly 8:17. Collins glanced toward the captain. The vault is beneath Terminal 1. Security has already begun the retrieval. The businessman gave a frustrated laugh. You are telling me an entire commercial flight is waiting for a box that has been locked for 3 decades. Collins met his stare without emotion. No. We are waiting because someone 31 years ago instructed this airline that if a passenger carrying that watch ever occupied this seat on this date, the vault must be opened immediately. A hush swept through the cabin. Marcus slowly lowered himself into his seat for the first time since boarding, as though the words had drained every ounce of strength from his body. Evelyn remained standing beside him. "Did your father ever mention this vault?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head. "He only told me that if I trusted his letter, everything else would find me." He reached into the inside pocket of his faded jacket and carefully unfolded a worn envelope whose edges had softened with age. The paper had been opened countless times. On the front, written in neat blue ink, were only 7 words. "Open after you reach seat 3 Alpha." Evelyn felt her breath catch. "Have you read it?" Marcus looked down at the envelope for several seconds before quietly answering, "I promised I would not." The promise seemed almost impossible to believe, yet everyone could see the seal remained unbroken. The businessman stared at the untouched envelope, and for the first time since Marcus boarded, uncertainty replaced confidence on his face. The teenager everyone had judged so quickly had carried the answer all along, yet had refused to satisfy even his own curiosity. Director Collins studied the envelope carefully before nodding almost to herself. "Then your father understood the sequence." She did not explain further. Instead, she closed the archive registry and stepped aside as another airport employee hurried aboard carrying a sealed evidence container protected by 2 security officers. Every conversation stopped again. The transparent container held a small leather pouch, darkened by decades of age. Attached to it was a yellow tag bearing a handwritten instruction. Collins broke the security seal, removed the pouch, and carefully emptied its contents into her gloved hand. A matching silver chain slid onto the table beside an old airline identification badge and a brass key no larger than a finger. Marcus stared at the key without blinking. So did the gray-haired historical operations employee. "It cannot be," he whispered. He picked up the faded identification badge and slowly turned it over. On the reverse side, nearly erased by time, someone had engraved the exact same initials hidden inside Marcus's pocket watch. Evelyn felt the pieces beginning to move into place, but the picture remained incomplete. Collins compared the badge to the photograph from the archive, then looked directly at Marcus with an expression that held equal parts disbelief and respect. "Your father did not send you here to receive something," she said quietly. "He sent you here to finish something that was never allowed to be completed." Before anyone could ask what that meant, the captain's radio crackled once more. He listened in silence, then looked toward Collins with unmistakable alarm. "The executive historian has just arrived," he said, "and he insists the vault was never supposed to be opened because someone inside this company has been protecting the secret all these years." The temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop the moment the captain finished speaking. Director Collins closed the leather pouch with deliberate care, slipped the brass key back inside, and handed everything to one of the security officers. "Nobody leaves this aircraft," she ordered quietly. The words landed harder than anyone expected. The businessman who had challenged Marcus since boarding rose from his seat in disbelief. "Now we are being detained." Collins did not look at him. "No, you are now witnesses." That single sentence changed the atmosphere completely. The passengers were no longer frustrated travelers waiting on a delayed flight. They had become unwilling participants in something much larger than themselves. Marcus felt every heartbeat echo through his chest. His father's unopened letter rested inside his jacket, heavier now than the silver watch in his hand. Evelyn noticed him staring toward the rain-covered window instead of the people around him. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Marcus answered without taking his eyes off the runway. "If my father knew this would happen, why did he never tell me the truth?" Evelyn did not have an answer. Before she could respond, the aircraft door opened with unusual force. An elderly man in a dark overcoat climbed aboard accompanied by 2 airline attorneys. Unlike everyone else who had entered the cabin, he ignored Marcus completely. His attention locked onto Director Collins. "This process ends now," he said calmly. "Seal every document. Return the artifacts to storage. Prepare the aircraft for departure." Collins remained still. The board authorized the release. The board was not fully informed. His voice never rose, yet every word carried quiet authority. The historical operations employee stepped forward holding the old photograph. Sir, the registry matches the watch. I know exactly what it matches, the elderly man interrupted. That is why these records remain sealed. A wave of uncertainty swept through the cabin again. Marcus looked from one face to another, realizing that the people arguing seemed to know far more about his father than he ever had. The elderly man finally turned toward him. His expression held neither anger nor kindness, only deep exhaustion. Young man, he said, if you open that letter today, everything your father tried to protect will disappear forever. Marcus instinctively pressed the envelope against his chest. Every instinct told him not to break his promise. Yet every unanswered question had led him to this seat. Evelyn stepped between them without hesitation. You are asking him to walk away without knowing why his father sent him here. The man nodded once. Sometimes honoring the dead requires accepting what you will never know. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment. His fingers trembled for the first time all day. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and a narrow beam of evening sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a single line of light across the motionless pocket watch. The hand still pointed to 8:17. Then something almost impossible happened. With a faint metallic click, the minute hand twitched forward by less than a fraction before stopping again. The historical operations employee gasped. Collins immediately reached for the watch. Do not move it. The elderly man took one step forward, genuine alarm replacing his composure. No, he said sharply. If that watch starts running, the letter must never be opened. Marcus looked down at the unopened envelope in one hand and the trembling silver watch in the other. Every person around him seemed desperate for him to make a different choice, yet no one would tell him why. Slowly, with every eye fixed upon him, he slipped one finger beneath the untouched seal of his father's letter just as the elderly man shouted for airport security to stop him. Marcus stopped just before breaking the seal. The entire cabin seemed to hold a single breath. Airport security had reached the aisle, but none of them dared touch him. The elderly executive took another cautious step forward, his confident voice now edged with something that sounded remarkably like fear. Please, he said, your father never wanted this opened unless there was absolutely no other choice. Marcus slowly lowered the envelope without taking his eyes off the man. Then tell me why. The question lingered unanswered. Director Collins turned toward the executive. You have had 31 years to explain. If you stay silent now, he has every right to read it. The old man closed his eyes for a moment, then quietly removed his airline identification badge and placed it on the armrest beside Marcus. My name is Charles Whitmore, he said. I was the airline's chief historian before I became an executive. I have protected this secret almost my entire career. The passengers listened without a sound. Whitmore looked at the silver pocket watch before speaking again. The story everyone believed was wrong from the very beginning. Evelyn felt the words strike harder than any accusation. Marcus remained perfectly still. Whitmore nodded toward the weathered photograph resting inside the archive box. The captain in that photograph was Daniel Mercer. Officially, the company recorded that he saved an entire flight during an emergency and became one of this airline's greatest heroes. He paused, his voice growing quieter. That was only half of the truth. Director Collins carefully opened another folder from the archive box. Inside rested an original maintenance report covered with handwritten signatures. The historical operations employee stared at it in disbelief. This report was never digitized. Whitmore answered softly, because someone ordered it destroyed. Collins laid the report beside the photograph. The signatures matched the initials hidden inside Marcus's pocket watch and the old identification badge recovered from the vault. Marcus leaned forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. Whitmore looked directly into his eyes. Your father, Samuel Reed, was not a passenger. He was the overnight maintenance mechanic who discovered a structural failure minutes before boarding. He warned Captain Mercer that the aircraft could not safely depart. The businessman who had questioned Marcus from the beginning slowly sat back into his seat, unable to speak. Whitmore continued. The captain trusted your father without hesitation. Together they stopped the flight before anyone boarded. Hundreds of lives were spared. Silence spread across the cabin like sunlight after a storm. Marcus stared at the old photograph again. His father stood beside the smiling captain, but only one of them had ever been remembered. Whitmore swallowed hard. The company celebrated the captain because he was visible. Your father signed a confidentiality agreement to protect the airline while investigators corrected the defect. He accepted complete anonymity because he believed saving lives mattered more than recognition. Evelyn quietly wiped a tear from her cheek before she even realized it had fallen. Every suspicious glance directed at Marcus suddenly felt painfully small. Collins gently placed the brass key into Marcus's hand. Your father was promised something in return, she said. Not money, not publicity. A permanent promise that one seat on one flight each year would always belong to his family if they ever wished to return. Marcus looked at the motionless pocket watch. At that exact instant, its hands began moving again with a clear, steady ticking that echoed through the silent cabin. Whitmore's face lost every trace of color. He whispered, almost to himself, "Then the final promise has awakened, which means there is one document left that none of us have ever seen, and only Marcus has the right to open it now." Marcus looked at the envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal his father had trusted him to protect for so many years. No one interrupted him. The steady ticking of the silver pocket watch filled the cabin with a quiet rhythm that somehow felt louder than every engine outside. He unfolded a single handwritten page, its edges yellowed with time, and read silently at first. Then his voice, almost too soft to hear, carried across the rows. "If you are reading this, then the promise was stronger than fear." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Do not come here to defend my name. Come only if the people who remember are finally ready to tell the truth." Marcus lowered the page, his eyes glistening but steady. Director Collins gently extended her hand. "May I?" Marcus nodded. She read the letter carefully, then looked toward Charles Whitmore. "He never demanded recognition," she said. "He asked for honesty." Whitmore closed his eyes. Every line on his face seemed deeper than before. Without a word, he reached inside his briefcase and removed a slim leather folder that had remained hidden beneath several legal documents. He placed it on the tray table beside Marcus. "I kept this because I could never bring myself to destroy it," he admitted. Collins opened the folder and slowly drew out the original recommendation signed by Captain Daniel Mercer. The final paragraph had never appeared in any official record. It read that Samuel Reed had refused financial compensation and requested only one lasting promise. If his family ever returned to the airline, they should be welcomed not as guests of privilege, but as family whose quiet courage had protected countless strangers. Evelyn lowered her head, overwhelmed by the simplicity of the request. Around the cabin, passengers who had once whispered accusations now avoided Marcus's eyes, each silently confronting the memory of their own assumptions. The businessman who had challenged Marcus from the beginning stood and slowly walked into the aisle. He stopped several feet away, unable to come any closer. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," he said quietly. "I cannot undo that." Marcus folded the letter with the same care his father had once used. "You do not have to undo it," he replied. "Just do better the next time someone walks onto a plane." No bitterness touched his voice, only calm. Evelyn smiled through tears she no longer tried to hide. Collins immediately contacted airline headquarters. Within minutes, the cabin speakers chimed once again. This time the announcement came directly from the airline's chief executive officer. Every passenger listened as the executive formally acknowledged that Samuel Reed's contribution had been omitted from company history and declared that the historical record would be corrected in full, effective immediately. Applause began softly before spreading through the entire cabin. Whitmore remained standing in silence, his shoulders finally relaxing after carrying the secret for more than 3 decades. Collins then picked up the small brass key recovered from the vault and placed it back into Marcus's palm. "There is one last place this belongs," she said. "Your father never lived to see it." Marcus closed his fingers around the key and looked through the rain-cleared window as the first rays of evening sunlight broke across the runway. Ground crews had begun preparing the aircraft for departure at last, yet no one reached for a seatbelt. Every person aboard understood that one final promise still waited beyond this flight, and only after that promise was fulfilled would Samuel Reed's journey truly come to an end. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate just as the last light of evening settled across the runway, yet the journey that mattered most did not end when the wheels left the ground. By the following afternoon, Marcus Reed stood inside the airline's original history gallery, a quiet room tucked beside the headquarters where framed photographs stretched across generations of pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, and ground crews whose names had shaped the company. Director Collins walked beside him carrying the restored maintenance report. Charles Whitmore followed a few steps behind, looking older than he had the day before, but lighter somehow, as though 31 years of silence had finally slipped from his shoulders. Evelyn Harrington arrived without cameras, reporters, or assistants. She had quietly declined every invitation to turn the moment into a public event. This belonged to Marcus and to a man who had never asked to be remembered. A small display stood beneath an empty space on the gallery wall. The brass key rested in Marcus's hand. Collins nodded toward a narrow wooden cabinet built into the display. Your father asked that this remain locked until the truth was complete. Marcus inserted the key. The old lock turned with a gentle click. Inside rested a polished bronze plaque wrapped in protective cloth. Collins carefully lifted it into the light. Freshly engraved beneath Captain Daniel Mercer's name appeared another line that visitors would now read forever. Samuel Reed, aircraft maintenance specialist. Quiet courage saved every soul on board. No spotlight illuminated the plaque. No dramatic music filled the room. Only a long, respectful silence settled over everyone present. Whitmore stepped forward first. His voice nearly disappeared as he spoke. I protected the company's reputation because I believed it was the responsible thing to do. I should have protected the truth instead. Marcus looked at the older man for a moment before extending his hand. Whitmore accepted it with both of his own, unable to hide the tears gathering in his eyes. Across the room, Evelyn quietly asked Collins for one final favor. Make certain every new employee learns both names together. Collins smiled. Already done. Later that afternoon, the businessman from the flight arrived carrying no gifts and offering no speeches. He simply stood before the new plaque, removed his boarding pass from the previous day, folded it once, and placed it inside the visitor memory book beside a short handwritten sentence. I will never judge the next stranger before learning the first chapter of their story. Marcus noticed it only as he prepared to leave. He smiled gently, but left the note where it belonged. Some lessons did not need an audience. Before walking away, Marcus removed the silver pocket watch from his jacket one final time. Its hands moved smoothly now, keeping perfect time. He glanced at the photograph of his father standing beside Captain Mercer, then carefully placed the watch inside the display cabinet beneath the plaque. It had carried a promise across 3 decades. It did not need to travel any farther. As Marcus and Evelyn stepped outside together, airplanes climbed one after another into a clear American sky, and through the gallery window the steady ticking of a once silent watch blended forever with the quiet history of a man whose greatest act was never asking to be remembered, only trusting that one day the truth would find its own seat.